king of podcasts, proudly presents The Broadcasters Podcast. The Broadcasters Podcast. A weekly media commentary talking about traditional and digital media headlines and talking to the content creators out front and behind the scenes. Here is the king of podcasts. Welcome to episode 109 of the Broadcasters Podcast. Tonight, we're going to focus mostly on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Once again, the Trump administration, unlike many other times in the past, is looking at a possible cut or removal altogether of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Now, we understand that some people are saying that this is a political issue, and it is one political side that goes to this. But see, I don't want to put that context into the light here of my argument tonight. What I want to talk about is the fact that I don't like a corporate entity funded by government controlling programming unless it's done right. I think for many years, the BBC's actually done a pretty good job of providing the public with good programming, the CBC the same way. But I don't think that PBS or NPR has really served the same suit. I never felt like it has. That's what I want to talk about tonight. So tonight I want to get into the story as to the history of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, the money they've been getting, how's it being allocated, and talk about what would be maybe a better idea of what to do, not necessarily with the money, because this is the thing. I'm not worried. What I don't want to do is have handouts being given to broadcasters when they're not serving, when there's not access to the public to get the word out of what they want to talk about. Because really, there is a lack of local journalism. There's a lack of community programming, and organizations to have a platform for them to go ahead and speak out, whether it's podcasts that are being produced or radio programs or live coverage, whatever there is. But there should be room for, civics, city programming, for particular government programming to serve the local and the public interest. And I don't want that to be done by a corporate entity being funded nonprofit. I don't want that. And I think instead of people raising money towards this, I would rather that they actually have, a way for these stations to be publicly supported in a different way. Instead of the money being funneled like it does to member stations and it goes to all this other stuff where there's a big national pot and then it gets divvied out. And then there's money that's being asked of by the government. Now, the thing is, there's a lot of money being put in to fund these stations. But the problem is we're seeing a lot of programming that is grossly being put at a high overhead. A lot of people are getting paid very well in Washington, D.C. And I think there's a lot of voices out there of different political, social, cultural persuasions that don't have a chance to be heard. I like the idea of public access and creating stations, or having the ability for stations to be bought and owned by other owners with, grants, block money, things like that through states. So that can be done that way. Maybe have state public radio and not national public radio. And if there is a national public radio, then it should just be an entity that services affiliates, much like traditional commercial radio does now. We should have a non-commercial radio that runs that way. I mean, it's the same way as the churches, right? If they're going to be run not-for-profit as well, that's the same way those stations run as well. I would rather have that. And maybe you have programming out there that's going to be opened up for the market. There are certain stations, don't get me wrong, in the NPR fold that actually do a pretty good job. A lot of big city stations do a lot for their communities, but really, they could do more. And I think there's a stranglehold as to kind of programming that's out there. I mean, look, Miami, New York, what have you. Yeah, you want to have all these stations that are programming BBC World Service overnight. Well, we don't have local programming. Just because NPR has a deal to go and run that because they don't want to have people running overnight running programming. And, the way they run their programming in the first place, I don't necessarily subscribe to either. Like, I think there are certain programs, not just to mention this. When you ask yourself, how often are people listening on the FM or AM dials? Remember, NPR has FM signals, strong, great FM signals. And people are not really listening to the stations to really fund their programming. NPR is getting their best help from their NPR One app and from the podcast themselves. Think about it like that. That's really what's happening right now, and that's what I want to bring up tonight. So that's what I got for you. The Joshua Otten interview that I started off last week, I am going to table that part 2 interview for next week's episode. So if you're looking for that, I'm going to table that because I want to spend the hour tonight on this story and a few other things, because I think the discussion of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the possible funding cuts, even if it doesn't happen, I think this is just a good discussion to have, because this really goes to the meat of the matter as to having creativity and availability out there for everybody. Like, I want radio to be a village, a public forum. And there should be a forum where local radio is allowed. So don't leave it to the commercial types that they're not going to do a good job. Let's give it back to public radio owners, and let's give it back to organizations that'll run it. That's what I would rather want. And I think that would do much better for people. And I think that would really serve the public a great deal. So let's get into the story. Here's what really started things off. First off, from Deadline.com, they take the story and we'll work with this, Ted Johnson's article. President Donald Trump again wants to eliminate funding for public media, but Congress likely won't let him. So President Trump's new budget calls for all but eliminating funding for public media. It's the 4th year in a row the White House has called for slashing funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds public TV stations, PBS and NPR, National Public Radio. Past proposals have been stopped in Congress, which sets budget levels for federal agencies. Even when Republicans held both chambers of Congress, which they are the leading group of partisan politicians that would like to go and defund public broadcasting. Yes, that is true. But again, I am not necessarily saying that we need to eliminate it and then get rid of it off the map. I have a different way of proposing this. So now, in the story, in the fiscal year 2021 budget, which has been proposed, this has not actually been made in public yet, but it would scale back discretionary funding across the board, increasing military spending. Allocation for public media would be reduced from $450 million to $30 million, which would basically be, the $30 million would be used to phase out the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. CPB would be phased out and eliminated the following year. Public media advocates say that the CPB funding is especially essential for small and medium-sized stations, the loss of which would threaten the structure of the PBS network. Now, this is what I have to say about the small and medium-sized stations. There are only so many of the stations that actually carry the news programming and the other programming that is on member NPR stations. So you got to ask yourself, I mean, are we getting any real favor from those stations at all? Because they're running classical music, they're running other programming, and they're not even running anything that is part of the NPR banner, but yet they are NPR stations. Like, these stations do not run the same programming altogether. Some of them just choose not to, or they might, on the rare occasion, have something local online. But that's the idea. Now, among other things, there would also be elimination of funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, and this, here's the thing. Now, they want to talk about the interview that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had with Mary Louise Kelly as part of All Things Considered, which was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't believe that was. But, there have been people that have talked about the fact of where some radio hosts, one is conservative radio host Lark Levin, he says, quote, "Why does NPR still exist? We have thousands of radio stations in the U.S. plus satellite radio, podcasts. Why are we paying for this big government Democratic Party propaganda operation?" But now public broadcasting has enjoyed broad support among lawmakers who often turn to the local outlets for appearances on public affairs programming. Public media advocates have also been successful at mobilizing viewers to contact members of Congress when it looks like their funding is threatened. Okay, but here's the thing. When I've looked at what's happened along with the issues of public broadcasting, when they talk about the public affairs programming, see, what we don't understand is that there is a rule in play where commercial radio stations as part of, I forget which act it is, but they're required to carry public affairs programming, even if it might be run 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. It is out there. And there are state political programs out there available, and there's time available for certain programming, and it can be podcasted. Does it need to be run 7 days a week? I don't know. But there could be stations that could carry this kind of programming and really do something where they offer, maybe there's some kind of a kickback that a station gets for doing this. If you had a station that was getting some kind of grant money or be able to get nonprofit status, okay, 501c3 status as a radio station, much like the Christian outlets, the religious outlets, if they were able to get this out there and give some stations this 501c3 status, become nonprofit, and then it's, listener funded. And then you have organizations that will also help out in the same vein. And all they have to worry about is operational costs and the cost for overhead of their team and who they have out there. I think that's a pretty good way to kind of go. Because I think there would be stations that would be, if they knew they were better run, I think people would really serve best by going to that. And knowing their podcasts are also being made available, so they have on-demand live programming, live and local. I think there's a price for that, and I think people would actually donate towards that. Because they remember, if NPR goes away and this member money goes away, then these organizations can go to other places and put their programming on. And not pay for everybody else. That's the whole point. Why do we want an organization, why do we want stations that are being paid for to cover markets we're not even listening to? Because that's not what's happening. There's this funding that comes from the government, plus they get to ask for money from the members. The members could also go ahead and put money in towards the podcasting, the other programming that's out there, instead of going for that. Now, Patricia Harrison, she's the CEO of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. In a statement, she says that the federal outlay is, quote, the foundation of our uniquely American public-private partnership that supports our nation's public media system. She says the federal appropriation is seed money and pays individual invaluable dividends to millions of Americans and their families in form of content and resources that educate, inform, and inspire. No. See, I would rather that money actually be given to actual government, or like public programs, not content. There's content out there for everybody, okay? There's local journalists that are out there. You could do a thing where you could offer programs to help out. I'm sorry, but Patricia Harrison saying that public media offers dividends to millions of Americans, that's a nice way to spinning it, but I don't believe it's true. I don't think we need to have this kind of setup here. I think there's a thing that's got to be said about allowing more to happen with what the money is, with $400 million can be used to do something more with. And that's what I'm talking about. Patrick Butler, the president and CEO of America's public TV stations, said that they are hopeful Congress will again increase public media funding for the next year to restore the nearly $100 million in purchasing power public broadcasting lost over a decade of frozen funding. They already get $450 million a year, and now you want to increase it. And this past December, they actually got in the federal spending bill a $20 billion funding boost. Are we really getting what's our money's worth as taxpayers out of $500 million a year given to that company? And they get money from other things because they can underwrite, they can sell advertisements in the form of underwriting, and they get all this money from other companies and organizations. You can't tell me the MacArthur Foundation and the Knight Foundation and these others are forking out so much money to cover the costs. No, they're asking the listeners to pay for it. Let's change it up. Why do we need to give donations? Have them buy a subscription to your podcasting, premium services. Put it through like a Patreon type of fund, crowdfunding type deal. Why can't we do that? In the recent spending bill, the National Endowment for the Arts funding was increased to $162.25 million, the largest amount in a decade. The Endowment for the Humanities also received a similar increase. So again, as the cuts were being proposed, we actually ended up seeing more money being put in to these organizations. Now, Robert Lynch, CEO for the Americans for the Arts, an advocacy group that the NEA has given grants to every congressional district throughout all 50 states and U.S. territories. He says, quote, "It's because of this that the congressional appropriators have chosen in the previous 3 years to reject the administration's call for termination of the agency and instead provide increased funding. They expect similar action by Congress this year and hopefully a $7.75 million increase." That's what they expect. Interesting. So anyway, let's go ahead and break down this story. The need for it, where the money's going, is there a need for it at all? First Amendment Watch, which is part of New York University, they talked about this story. The chilling effect of public broadcasting funding cuts. This is prior to the threat of cutting funding back in 2018. So let's go back and what's been done. So the Trump administration, yes, they have been the focus of trying to go and make cuts. The 2018 budget aimed to eliminate funding altogether, providing upwards of 15% of the budget for public broadcasters and NPR and other local stations. The administration's rationale, non-federal funding is robust, and public broadcasters no longer need to rely on federal dollars. May 2017, they also survived budget cuts. March 2017, public broadcasters reached out to viewers for help with local reps. March 2017, at the same time, the CPB officials testified on Capitol Hill on public broadcasting budget cuts. And the argument has been said about rural stations if the budgets fail, if they went away. New York Times would talk about that the CPB supported 1,500 radio stations. And the Times noted that while broadcasters in major media markets such as New York City receive only a small portion of funding from the federal government, rural stations are heavily dependent on federal money. The American Prospect, back in March 2017, Michael Soha wrote a story, said, "Who loses if Trump cuts public media funding?" The argument here for Michael Soha is that eliminating public broadcasting will increase the urban-rural divide and further exclude rural voices from the national conversation, claiming that public broadcasting offers some of the most neutral coverage in the country. Despite poorly evidenced claims of liberal bias, NPR has actually gone easier on Trump than many media outlets. I don't care about that. Privately owned outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post, NPR doesn't use any particular terms or any falsehoods or outright propaganda. They say that they are a neutral arbiter. If anything, public media journalists feel a special obligation to showcase the full spectrum of voices and perspectives from across America. In March 2017, the argument also came from Howard Huscock, who serves on the board of directors for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. He wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post arguing that it does not deserve continued federal funding. Quote, "While the CPB was an essential resource in the initial years after its founding, public media now rarely offers anything that Americans can't get from for-profit media or that can't be supported privately." End quote. There's the other argument. While in the past, public broadcasting offered the only alternative of the three networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, there's now an explosion of cable outlets, partisan news sites, and satellite radio that offers listeners a range of choices. Huscock also argues that the original mission to provide programming to underserved demographics and a, quote, broad cross-section of the American public, end quote, is no longer accurate. Huscock also concedes that public media does provide an indispensable resource of local news coverage, but ultimately concludes unless the CBB can demonstrate that it can truly serve diverse audiences in ways the private market can't, it deserves to be zeroed out. I think it's a pretty good point. I would read the whole story, but of course it's behind a paywall. Now let's talk about the actual starting of the CPB. It's gone back over 50 years. Actually, it's 53 years to be exact. The Corporation of Public Broadcasting is a private nonprofit corporation. It was created by the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, supporting 1,136 public radio stations 362 public TV stations. The CPB formed PBS in 1969, National Public Radio in 1970. Now, calls for defunding have gone as far back as President Nixon. A New York Times story from February 1979 details how the Nixon administration aimed to rein in what was anti-administration content. The article states, quote, the papers confirm suspicions that had been aroused by White House actions during that period that the administration was tampering with the board of directors of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, was using federal appropriations as a device to force a reorganization of the system along lines prescribed by the White House. Also, Presidents Reagan and George W. Bush called for cutting CPB costs. 1997, there was a chance that CPB could have gone away altogether, but there was a measure to eliminate it from the federal budget in the year 2000. It was voted down by the Republican-controlled House 345 to 78. And in 2005, Republicans had both chambers of the Congress and White House, and that move was rolled back by a coalition of House Republicans voting to reinstate the money that had been removed in committee. So there's that. So now, it's a not-for-profit. Regardless, is it doing what it's needing to do to help successfully and responsibly use their funding for what they need to do to their stations and to their talent and to the administration? How is it really divvied out? Because you got to ask yourself that question too. Let's break down what they're actually been doing. Now, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting receives federal funding from Congress 2 years in advance per the Public Broadcasting Act. Once received, CPB distributes funding based on a formula that is set in law. The majority of funding, 71%, is sent directly to public radio and TV stations. We don't know where it goes to, though, as far as I know. It is made to produce local programming, which I look at, and just in my market, West Palm Beach, Fort Pierce, Boca Raton, market 49, and market 10, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood. Okay? We have a couple of stations here. When we're talking about NPR, so at the moment, NPR is on a translator, if I'm correct. Actually, 101.7. I think we have WCNO 88.9, which is out of Fort Pierce, that covers West Palm Beach. It runs classical only. And a couple of set programs, and that's it. No local coverage whatsoever. We had WXCL. That got sold to Educational Media Foundation. And WLRN was servicing programming. It is servicing programming, I think, through 101.9, I think it is, on the FM dial on a translator. But they're just simulcasting WLRN FM 91.3 out of Miami. And WLRN offers, I think, roughly, daytime work hours. They offer local news on the half hour, I think, rarely. And a couple of local programs. That's it. Otherwise, their programming is run across the board national. National NPR News, national programming. I mean, it's a very small news department. They have a relationship with the Miami Herald, so they're really not worrying so much about broadcasting local content or doing a lot of investigative. A lot of students do their own programming on that channel as internships for the Miami Media School. So they're getting a lot of volunteer help and a lot of help from other organizations to produce programming. Otherwise, I see a lot of marketing for it. I see it being advertised on buses and other forms of transportation. So there's that. Otherwise, there's not a lot of local programming on it. It's also supposed to provide community services in news, education, public safety, and more. I believe it covers the school board. I think that's what WLRN TV does. Other than that, WLRN doesn't offer local programming on television. And the WPBT has done local programming in the past that was very important. Nightly Business Report with Paul Kangas, Jack Horkheimer, the Star Hustler. And we also had Que Pasa USA. We had a number of different programs. The thing is, we had certain programs that came from member stations that were produced by member stations, got a good funding, and therefore they would get pushed off into major markets. Sesame Street was a national model. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was produced out of Pittsburgh, station WQED. I believe the same thing went for 123 Contact, Electric Company, among others. And there are other programs that are produced by like WNYC in New York, WBUR in Boston. That was what used to run On Point with Tom Ashbrook. I don't know who hosts that now or what replaced that. I don't remember. Those are the stations. Those are the shows that WNYC produces, but they're not so much national programs. I mean, NPR has their news division that does a pretty good job. I'll give it that. And the other programs, you have This American Life, which is based out of Chicago. And what else? Think about what you have in other areas. Think about that. What other programming do we get that's so tangible? And also, it's being done for podcasting, right? And most of the audiences for these programs on NPR are on podcasts. On the Media with Bob Garfield, Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Like, I know these shows. I've listened to a little NPR in my time. I know people don't enjoy it. But honestly, you could easily go and find these on podcasts. It's very accessible. And honestly, in podcasting, NPR does some of the best work there is. They're the most popular because people know they go to it. They can wait for same day programming to listen to it. It doesn't have to be listened to live, right? And even if it's not CPB, you also have the other public broadcasting that comes out from, was it Marketplace? American Public Media? And I forget there's another show I used to hear once in a while. It was on the mornings as well, and I forget what it's called. So it's also made to purchase broadcast equipment, which, by the way, NPR, they're not cheap on their equipment. They actually got good quality equipment across the board. So these stations, they got maintenance, they got management. Like, honestly, these stations got good equipment across the board on all these stations. The remainder of the federal funding is divided accordingly. 18% is invested in the creation of the programming you enjoy and depend on. Only 18%. So broadcast equipment, acquire programming. What do you mean acquire programming? You have to pay for it? That sounds like commercial radio. Acquire programming. There's a payment for that? Why is there a payment for that? That doesn't make sense. 71%. Again, local programming, community services. So that's all what's being done within these stations. It's basically administrative costs. With some of it going towards programming. And remember, no sales division. There's not necessarily not any big production programming division. They're basically running what the NPR affiliates are supposed to run, with a couple of select programs that are run other places. Then there's 6% spent on system-wide support, including research, copyright fees, and national initiatives. 5% or less cover CPB operations. But you're not talking about what the 71% does. And I don't even know what the operations are. At least in this particular story I'm looking at, protectmypublicmedia.org. And they're explaining this. So the way it breaks down in the graphic they put over here is 71% goes directly to the stations. 18% of funds go to program producers, of which there are hundreds of program producers. 71% of the federal funds go to the stations, 1,500 local public and TV radio stations. CPB's mission is to provide Americans with free over-the-air access to local public media. Access. But why don't we give access to the actual people that want to do the programming, that can offer content? They're saying it's free. Yeah, it's access for free, sure. But how about giving them access to actually program the stations as a public station, serving the public? That's the point. Regardless of whether they live in an urban, suburban, rural, or remote area. Many rural communities rely on public media as their only source of local media. What? What, they don't have newspapers? They don't have online? Come on. In fact, 248 public TV and radio stations serve communities that are often unserved by their other local media services. Federal funding. So, and do you think they're getting served right now with what they're getting? Locally? Okay, if they're rural communities, are they getting ag reports? Are they getting announcements of rummage sales or, green markets or, festivals or what have you. Bake sales. Are they getting any of that information? Community calendars? Think about that. Now, the CBB funding is important because stations raise $6 for every federal dollar they receive from CBB, resulting in a highly effective public-private partnership. $6 for every federal dollar they receive. So if they're getting, put the numbers together right there. So they're basically funded 90% private. It's a lot of money they're getting right there. If they're getting $450 million and you're saying $6 for every federal dollar, then take $450 million to get a year, they're getting what? $2.5 billion? Or maybe $2 billion private? It's a lot of damn money. iHeartMedia wishes they had that kind of money. iHeartMedia doesn't even make that kind of money nationally altogether to pay off their bills. They wish they had $1 billion in revenue a year. $1 billion a year in revenue. And NPR and PBS, they're making $2 billion? Shit. Get out of here. That doesn't even give me any kind of feel to it, right? Now, you could say it's not a really big part of the budget because, look, Barack Obama's 2012 fiscal year budget, CBB funding was $445 million for fiscal 2012. 0.01% of President Barack Obama's, at the time, proposed $3.73 trillion budget, which I think he got all of it. And at that time, they had 1,300 locally owned stations, radio and TV stations. Now, going into the story that happened back in 2011, from McClatchy, D.C., they talked about public broadcasting backers fighting GOP plan to cut funds. There was a couple people a couple of congressmen that made some points that, I'm kind of leaning towards, right? Republican Steve Pierce, which was a Republican from New Mexico, he said, there are many things about public broadcasting I like, and I like the programming, but the question is, should it be a government function, and should we be spending money for when it's going to put your children and grandchildren into debt? Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, he said in a State of the State address back in 2012, quote, I like PBS that airs great programs, including, if I do say so myself, tonight's speech. But with hundreds of options in the free market, radio and television programming is not a core function of government requiring $4 million. Representative Earl Blumenauer, a Democrat from Oregon, he says that lots of Americans are concerned with spending a deficit. At the time, with the issues that were going on, and remember, we have a $24 trillion national debt right now. Anything we can try to cut out of the government spending, no matter which side of the bar you are, I think it's a good thing. I'm the kind of person that I like to stay independent, okay? If anyone wants to know where my political stance is, I'm independent, okay? I want less government intervention and government spending less of my taxpayer dollars. I want more of my money back. Meanwhile, I would say I'm more socially liberal when I would prefer that, if drugs want to be completely legalized, including marijuana, adult use, or medical, all for it. All in favor of it. Otherwise, I think people can have their vices and just people want to enjoy what they want. In my opinion, I think if you wanted to have that, want to legalize prostitution, legalize gambling, by all means, have at it. I'd rather have people have their opportunities to have what they want. If that's what they want, if it's going to ruin them, that's on them, right? I'd rather have people have options of what they want to do in their lives. When it comes to corporation public broadcasting and what they own, I'd rather have those stations, TV and radio, be given back to the people to run them themselves. Because we lost public access. We don't have that anymore. No radio stations, no TV stations offer that because they're all corporate owned. This is also a corporate run entity. And I don't like this environment. I would rather have stations that are being offered back to the public. And what better than give the non-commercial FM 92 and above stations back to the public, back to the people. Let them get these stations and do something with it. That's what I'd prefer. So I mentioned Howard Hussock. He wrote a story with the Washington Post. November 25th, 2019, he also talked about this. And he says, and this is a very interesting story, and he's a senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute. I brought him up a little earlier. Another story he brought up, which actually I thought was very interesting, is why the Public Broadcasting Act needs an update to save local public media journalism. Because the thing is, I don't know if it's actually serving local journalism. I mean, we already know that with digital journalism struggling right now, the digital disruption coming into play, obviously local media, citizenship journalism is down the wayside. And it would be nice to see where the Public Broadcasting Act actually served more, so these stations would not have so much opinion, but they would actually have news and information served to the public. Like that is the public interest. If you're going to have anything, that would be something more to be done. So let's entertain this article. It's back from my birthday, November 25th, 2019. The Knight Foundation, the Gallup organization, came back with another dispiriting report about local journalism. Not only have local newspapers closed by the hundreds and remaining local newsrooms have been hauled out, but surviving news organizations, find Gallup surveys, are not trusted much more than their national counterparts and judged to be doing a poor job at a core responsibility, holding local governments accountable. 60% of those polled feel that local media does a fair or poor job in this crucial regard. Look at that. Again, I would want to have that for all these corporate entities. When I am a creator or I'm a consumer, I want my radio stations to serve the public interest. The airwaves are owned by the public, by taxpayers. That's what's most important. It would seem to make for a more perfect opportunity for public radio still among the country's most trusted. But structural funding barriers pose a fundamental problem for local stations that want to do more to fill the local journalism void. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting strategy to help with grants is actually misguided. Its core local journalism initiative, regional journalism collaboratives, are based on priorities set by Washington, not localities. Bingo! These stations don't have any autonomy themselves. They're controlled by NPR and PBS in Washington. So they are no less than anybody else. They are corporate run. And that corporate culture festers bad things for all these stations. Not because of any particular agenda that Washington, D.C. wants to play. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that they only want to go with a national agenda. So are we really serving these rural areas, these local areas in particular? No. The 1967 Public Broadcasting Act itself is part of the problem. Although community service grants to local stations make up the vast majority of the $400+ million distributed by CPB, far too much of those funds must be sent back to NPR and PBS, both by statute in the case of NPR and necessity to purchase national programming and pay station dues. This is a union. Pay station dues and purchase national programming? How come they don't have to? How about they don't have to purchase national programming? How about you just barter that off? I mean, you require the stations to run it, but you don't make them pay for the programming. So the funding that you're giving, you're taking it back. Indian giving? No, that doesn't work, right? Now, just as crucially, the 1967 Act requires that 3/4 of funds go to television. At a time when radio and podcasts have emerged as the creative centers of public media, and Netflix, Amazon, and HBO have overtaken public television and offering documentary and creative drama, which has been the crucial portion of NPR and PBS. Local public radio is demonstrating that it has a key role in providing high-quality, fact-based journalism. But it's limited by the federal funding formula left over from a previous era. So again, they need to change what doesn't work anymore. Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 is for a different time when we had 3 network stations, network affiliates, in any given market, a limited amount of newspapers. We didn't have anything close to internet or any other alternative media. or any kind of disruption whatsoever. That's almost 30 years away. Local public radio is demonstrating that it has a key role in providing the journalism, like we said. Now, it is true, as CPB will assert, that the funder has ostensibly taken steps to support local journalism. Its key vehicle has been grants to what's been called regional journalism collaboratives, groups of stations working together. Such grants sound impressive, more than $32 million for regional and single-topic collaborations that involve stations in 42 states. Again, regional. Again, can we have maybe like a state initiative to run certain programming or certain reporting, and then have the local stations do the reporting themselves? Have them associate with newspapers or what other local outlets they can go to for media. This is a crucial limitation of such grant making, however. It is largely predicated on support for coverage of specific issues judged to be of importance to the regions. So, for instance, they could say it's agriculture in Kansas, water resources and renewable energy in Arizona, energy production and health in Pennsylvania, economic opportunity and quality of life in California, immigration on the Texas-Mexico border, among many others. The approach has a number of problems. It's fundamentally backward-looking. It seeks to support coverage of what CPB has judged to be of importance rather than issues that may emerge. There was a time when the opioid abuse crisis was not yet recognized for what it is. That was a time for a local public radio newsroom to cover a city council meeting and discover concern about the overdoses in local hospital emergency rooms and to begin to sound the alarm. How about this? Nobody wants to talk about the pandemic of the coronavirus. And from what I've been hearing, is there any local, mobilization to make sure if the coronavirus makes it into this country to where the possibility of 60 to 80% of the population could be somewhat affected or exposed to it? And local authorities are not making changes about it, or there's not any kind of outcry to talk about people need to be protected if, for whatever reason, there's a pandemic that comes across into... Now, moving along, listeners and viewers need to be able to turn to local public media outlets as a daily habit. One-off programs can be trees falling in the wilderness. The good news is major market stations, and this is what NPR does do. The local stations that they have in the major markets, WNYC, New York, WBUR, Boston, WGBH, and I believe that's in Pittsburgh, KPCC, KERA, KQED. I think KQED is San Francisco. I don't know where KERA and KPCC are. Many others. They're providing the daily local journalism that can both fill a news void and attract financial support. The bad news is that small local licensees in areas which philanthropic programming funding is limited have not been able to do the same. Because the Knights and the James T., the MacArthur Foundations and all these people that normally fund stations, they'll fund for like art centers and for programming that might be in a local market. But there's nothing of any cultural or artistic portions in, say, Minot, South Dakota, or, whatever. Think about it like that. Topeka, Kansas, Oklahoma City, things like that. So he's saying that all this requires amending and adjusting the 1967 Act, which currently favors incumbent grant recipients along with purposes such as independent documentaries and original drama that the market now supplies. Smaller stations to band together demand change. Good, trusted community journalism demands it. And there you go. I think it's a pretty good story to be said. I think they make a lot of points. I think Howard makes a lot of good points in this article. So let's move along here. The next thing that comes up as well is also a chance to cut funding for the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Now, according to Broadcasting and Cable, John Egerton reports that the Trump administration is proposing to significantly cut funding to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which oversees U.S. international broadcasting for Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Free Asia. This organization got $810 million in 2020. Now, they don't want to remove it all together. They just want to cut the funding down. They want to cut it to $637 million in 2021. And so the new 2020 budget that's been proposed would be to refocus the program to improve efficacy, and reduce duplication, and modernize research and better manage its grants. Now, these are news agencies you probably never even heard of. You might never have listened to before. I have, because I've always been looking for certain content just to find, when I want to look for content that is absolutely straight up, that is not biased, that just reports. Christian Science Monitor, Reuters, Associated Press, objective places to catch my news. So one of the organizations is Voice of America. It was signed into law in 1976, protecting the independence and integrity of the programming. It communicates directly with the peoples of the world by radio. Then there's Radio Free Europe, which is also called Radio Liberty, promoting democratic values and institutions by reporting the news in countries where free press is banned by the government or not fully established. And there's the Office of Cuban Broadcasting, Radio and TV Marti, which offers news and information programming objectively to the island of Cuba. Radio Free Asia does the same for Asian countries. And there's the Middle East Broadcasting Networks and the Open Technology Fund, which supports open technologies and communities that increase free expression, circumvent censorship, and obstruct repressive surveillance as a way to promote human rights and open societies. So again, they want to bring that all down quite a bit. Again, when I get back to my original point, I just say to myself, can we do something to get radio stations back to the public airways, get people back to listen to radio when you have people that are actually there in the building able to broadcast? Again, it's removing the corporate radio model from an organization that doesn't need to be that way. I would rather these stations and these signals be given back to the public. For any of you that have been listening to this podcast since day one, you know that the intent of this program is for me to be an advocate for content creators, for those that are talent in front of the camera and on the microphone, or those behind the scenes, and all the great things that they do individually to create great entertainment, great information, all of that. I want to be able to be entertained, informed, put through all the different emotions. I want to engage and consume great content. And so for me, it's important that there is access to everybody to get that opportunity. And the problem is that I always see where there's a lot of corporate political correctness, social culture that really gets in the way. Corporate is a major factor, and we see that across the board. I think a lot of people can understand where I'm coming from there. NPR brought up a story like this, and we mentioned that before. I'm pretty sure I mentioned the story exactly. Marissa Moss's story from NPR.org about a new proposal looking to loosen radio ownership rules. Marissa mentions that the Telecommunications Act of 1996 became law, loosening regulations on how many stations a single company could own. We know about that. The impact of radio consolidation of the Telecommunications Act have faded since then. A new proposal on local ownership could change the face of AM/FM forever. Spearheaded by the NAB, National Association of Broadcasters, the proposal, called the quadrennial review, could make the concept of local radio nearly extinct. Several groups were opposing it. The proposal calls for weakening current rules on how many stations a company could own in a given place, allowing larger broadcasters like iHeart and Cumulus to swallow up almost every station in the state. Again, and these are companies that are running out of money. They don't have the money to go for anything. So why would we want to go and have all that happen? That's what I don't want to have happen. And so for me, we have to see what will happen, what comes up, and realize that we need to get somewhere where if we can't fix corporate radio, we can't get it to implode, we can't make that change, then the case needs to be that we have to find opportunities out there to get more out for people to get into, right? To be able to go ahead and have access to the airwaves, access to get exposed, to be seen, heard, television and radio. Because honestly, there is digital online as a sports out there, but let's just open everything out there for everybody, right? Like, why not? That's what it used to be, and I would hope it would be that way again. All right, that's why I said it was going to take me most of the hour, because I knew there was a lot to say about this. Meantime, I want to go and bring up one of those stories before I wrap things up, and that is from a story that came up late last week. Kid Kelly, who had been in hit radio nationally for decades, last 4 decades, as a matter of fact, coming into his 4th decade now. Steve Knopper wrote in Billboard about Kid Kelly opening up, the former Sirius XM pop guru, on why he lost his job on the very bad city radio. And this guy did a hell of a job. Okay? He ran the hit radio station on Sirius XM, Sirius Hits 1. That was him. He has worked at 30 radio stations and engineered the satellite radio giant's influential pop format. He says that Sirius Hits 1 station build I envisioned reapplied the then crazy theory of playing the most passionate music of all genres, besides the typical ones played on an external top 40 CHR station of the time. This radio letter, this open letter he wrote to everybody to go and read about. Now he says that any legacy I might have in radio is associated with the 13 years I spent at Z100 in New York City, or the long-time syndicated backtrack 80s and 90s shows, and that he has his additional legacy with his old home at Sirius XM Hits 1. When he came on board, it was a very fledgling company teetering on bankruptcy with 67,000 subscribers. It was because I firmly believed on this out-of-this-world pre-Wi-Fi smartphone concept would actually work. I was promised on several occasions there would be no useless or belaboring meetings, no reports, no spreadsheets, no corporate agendas. After accepting this position to manage the pop department, I was instantly laughed at by most of the then industry professionals and ignored by many others. With the exception of close friends, the consensus was I'd end a profile career joining the then non-entity, usually mispronounced Sirius or Cyrus or Sirius. For over a decade, I worked 18-hour days, weekends, and holidays. I consider myself late if I was not at my desk by 7 a.m. Monday through Friday, and I was usually the last one out. It was a big job to do, and I was an elite member of the team hired to make the pop portion of this then turkey fly. I relentlessly pushed my connections with labels, managers, publications to notice us, and I did my best to make them knowledgeable about us. Response was not resounding. I hounded at times embarrassed executives into recognizing that their own artists, including Taylor Swift, were huge here. How could they not know and know who we are? So he goes on, and let me go a little bit later on into what happens here. And then he did a Q&A with Billboard. And here's what he said. Let me go one more into the open letter real quick just to mention what he talks about. On Hits 1, I'd add select country, alternate rock, active rock, teen pump, and Europop, most of which were not then playing on FM Top 40 and not yet available on coalescing DSP pop playlists. When it began to root, most industry pros were stunned, perhaps astonished, ignored it, or scratched their heads as to what to do. Major label promo departments didn't get it, fought it, were confused or indifferent, then finally embraced it. Indie labels loved it, and they had equal footing. It disrupted most major top 40 stations that ignored or swore off this mix and begrudgingly began adding these outliers. Today, many of those channels win and are following the template of song rotations I applied and reapplied often. I didn't invent this mindset, mixer texture, but I will unequivocally state that I doggedly stayed focused, maintain intestinal fortitude, stay disciplined, and course corrected, and then confused, slanted, and mostly broken format, he felt like it was top 40, mainstream top 40. I did so based on what I learned from my past, as well as analyzing and dissecting legendary stations and what make them special, while constantly looking ahead daily. Take a point right there. You take what happened in the past, what radio worked, to do now. Because you can say what you want about Sirius XM and Howard Stern and what he contributes to the audience. That thing has 40 million listeners, I think it is right now. There's only 3 million that actually listen to Howard, that attest to listen to Howard. So Howard is not the end-all, be-all for Sirius, not like it was. I think a lot of people that go to Sirius XM because of the programming out there. I really think they do. Now, back in, he also talked about that, look. And this is the mentality I actually liked. He said about the examples of how you change the top 40 format in your work with hits one at Sirius XM. Quote, he said, I need a fresh crop of hits. I need it faster than FM was doing it. At the end of the year, I'm not going to play songs that aren't hits for 6 or 7 weeks when everybody goes on vacation. I was like, I've got to give people something worth paying for. Whatever tools we're using to market, whether it be the world's biggest gorilla, Howard Stern, or sports franchises, I wanted to better than those things. I wanted to be outstanding. That was another mindset. And then he brings up the state of radio itself, the corporate side. He says, quote, the state of radio, in my opinion, it's very, very bad. Radio companies or radio stations need to have the respect for the audience. If program directors are forced to play songs that they're uncomfortable with, or know they're not going to work, or there are group ads crammed down, or there are 20-minute blocks of commercials, the audience doesn't want that. Maybe somebody has to walk away and take a loss. Do you understand that nobody's ever going to listen to your station again under a certain age because of that? It really needs to be fixed, or else it's going to be a vast, vast wasteland. Kid Kelly's right. I listened to him on Backtracks USA. I thought he did a damn good show. I thought he did a good job in general. He worked at great radio stations, okay? This guy has a hell of a career that he worked in when you think about what was going on. He left Sirius XM January 24th. Like he said, he worked 13 years at C100, the flamethrower, one of the biggest top 40 radio stations that ever came about. And to hear him have to say that about corporate radio and the fact that he lost his spot at Sirius XM, fighting so hard to really do what he needed to do. Because the one thing was, I always noticed of marketing for new records, Sirius XM was always one of the first stations that did that. And I wonder what that station is going to become now. I wonder if it even stays like that or not. It's unfortunate, nevertheless. And there you have it. We're going to leave it right there. Thank you for tuning in. I know a very, very radio-heavy night tonight. Didn't want to bring up the Oscars, but though I'll congratulate Joker and Joaquin Phoenix for winning. Like to see Brad Pitt was winning Best Supporting Actor for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I thought that was good. And other than that, I just got to hear the new Billie Eilish James Bond theme for No Time to Die. I love it. I think it's great. It definitely has the elements in there. And that's pretty much it. There's not much else to bring up in the other news, but I just thought this story right here really brought up a really good debate. And I would really love to hear what you think about it and what you would think about this all together yourselves. If there's a better use of the radio stations and TV stations that CPB owns, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I think it's a good debate to have. And it's regardless of the political aspirations of which side of Congress look at this anyway. For me, it doesn't matter. I just want a place for people to be able to put their craft out there, whatever kind of media it is, and thrive. That's what's important. That's what the Broadcasters Podcast is all about. Until next week, I will then play back for you part 2 of my interview with Josh Otten. Until then, make sure to remember that content is king and the control of your content is in your hands. Thank you for listening to the Broadcasters Podcast, presented by BroadcastersPodcast.com and KingofPodcasts.com. The Broadcasters Podcast is brought to you by KingofPodcasts.com/Amazon. If Amazon is good enough for the King of Podcasts, it most certainly is good for you. KingofPodcasts.com/Amazon. And don't forget to check out the King of Podcasts wrestling program. The Wrestling is Real podcast, exclusively at KingofPodcasts.com.